Last time we had breakout rooms, and for those who weren't there, we had 2 prompts. The first one was, what message would you send to all children growing up today? And the second one was, what kind of advice would you give to all parents? And, I've chosen those 2 prompts because I think they can really help us potentially to find more clarity on what, the central dysfunction of our contemporary Western cultural narrative is, and what we need to pay attention to intentionally, to bring it back into our hearts, into our minds, into our perception. And I think for me, how I see it, it's the fundamental role of relationships and interdependence of all forms of life on Earth and beyond, which is missing. That is really not very much considered in this dying cultural narrative, and that is exactly the reason why it is dying. And the old narrative is mainly all about, buying and selling, basically. And then wars about buying and selling, and alliances about buying and selling, and all of those things, which are happening. And slowly but surely, we are finding out that we are not just Homo economicus. This is like a principle, which has been coined by a man called John Stuart Mill in 1836. Assuming that individuals are fundamentally separate and are driven by self-interest and competition around buying and selling. It's a very, very narrow, very, very impoverished way of looking at human life. But that was once the concept, which was assumed to be universal. And, and looking at life from this vantage point is at the foundation of this separation of, the individual from the biosphere, from the planet. And you're becoming increasingly self-conscious, but not conscious of relationship and interdependence. And, and developing this rather dangerous inability to notice interdependence. And basically thinking, food grows on the shelves in the supermarket. And, educating, bringing up children who don't even know where food comes from. So it has gone that far, and now we are starting to wake up that we can't continue that way. This is really, it's dangerous, really, for ourselves and also for many other species. And, we're starting to, again, bring forth a different way of looking, where we are emphasizing interdependence and relationship. And I brought with me today a very well-known chart by a German scientist. I think it's like probably over 100 years old. And he's called Ernst Haeckel, and he shows us, the embryos of many different species. And to our surprise, if we look at these very early stages of life, of animal as well as of different fish and humans as well, we can see that they look almost identical in the beginning. For quite some time, they look almost identical, and then start to diversify. And I think that says it all, as we are emerging out of the biosphere, we all look almost the same. And then slowly over time, we start to develop different forms according to the environment where we are supposed to live and eat and procreate. So I want to screen share that in. There's a few people with me here in the room. Sorry that you can't see it, but I show it to you afterwards. So here it is. So I hope you can see that. So that one, that order here on that row here, that's a fish. Next one is a salamander, a tortoise, a chick, a hog, a calf, a rabbit, and a human. And in the beginning, they look almost the same. And then they slowly start to diversify. And what we all have the same is every single embryo from fish to salamander has a tail, including the human. We all have tails and we all have gills. It's amazing. So in the beginning, you couldn't tell the difference if you're not really, really deeply informed. So I think that gives me like a deep intuitive knowing, of our deep relatedness. And this is how life, emerges out of the biosphere. So that these drawings are by Ernst Haeckel, and he was a scientist and also an artist. So he has made astonishing drawings. He called it about art in nature. You can look it up on the internet. It's very, very beautiful. Many books he illustrated. So this astonishing, similarity. And then, through our programming in our DNA, we start to diversify. And here we are, then as human beings with this very large neocortex and all of these capacities, for technology and so on. And if we are not remembering our deep interconnectedness, then we use the technology to our own disadvantage, not even noticing it. So this is really the central remembrance, which needs to be trained. And I think that's what we are doing here on the Wednesdays, to try to remember this truth, which has gotten buried under a lot of education, which is much less life-serving than knowing this deep interrelatedness. And that's what, distinguishes us so much from indigenous ways of looking at life. For indigenous cultures, the most important fact is to make much of this interrelatedness, that we are all one family. And the book, which we have been mentioning, Becoming a Good Relative, because that's what we really need to learn, becoming a good relative. Because, all worldviews and all narratives are empty. And because of that, they can be changed. We have complete freedom in how we're going to shape this. But first, we need to understand the situation. And understanding in that context, isn't like only an intellectual understanding, but to really stand under it, to really go close to it and allow yourself to feel and sense into it. Just, what I did before, I was walking outside and then I was thinking, oh, I have to know, who are the tribes, who have lived here before this suburbia was built here. And so I went to the internet, and then I found out the names, the Unami people from the Lenape tribe. And then I went outside for a little walk and just trying to picture how it was here before all of these houses were built. It was very difficult to get a sense of it, because there's nothing left. And then I thought I could just go to one of the trees, Maybe the tree can help me to remember. There's some really mighty trees out there. And then I went to one of the trees and just was leaning against it. And there was kind of some connection came through, And then I walked a little bit further. There's a little park, and there was like a big stone with a plaque, which has been added there since I was here last time. And it spoke about a mayor or some kind of administrator of this area, a woman, and what she had done for the area. Beautifully, has done many good things, and but there was no mentioning anywhere about the original people who have lived here before. No mentioning. So, and then to sit and be with that recognition is confusing, is the mind doesn't know what to do. And then the practice would be to be with the confusion and not try to change it. There's no need to turn away from it, no need to frantically sort it out or feel guilty or beat yourself up or anything, but just the dissonance, allowing the dissonance to be what it is. And that's what I did as good as I could. And then it's really good to have other people we can talk about it, And I'm talking here about it with so many other people. I'm lucky. So, to sit with that, it changes us on a very deep level. And that's exactly what we need. And then at the same time, also knowing that, whatever is understood, whatever can be changed, it's always going to be partial, and it's always going to be impermanent. So, all social and cultural achievements can be beautiful, and then also they are partial. Just what I saw, in the park, the plaque for this woman who has done so much for the area, but a big part was left out, because this woman operated here in this area when this way of thinking hadn't yet emerged, into consciousness. And maybe, like 20 years ago, she was celebrated as the greatest administrator. And then like 20 years later, she is seen as somebody very unaware of what really matters. So it's an emergent path, and some of the principles, they are timeless and unchanging, but how those principles are lived, that is changing. The Noble Eightfold Path with these three different sections, of wisdom, ethics, and meditation. That's a timeless path, but we live it inside of history. So it needs to be expressed according to what is really mattering at this particular time. How harmlessness needs to be embodied is sometimes different than at other times. And that can be, it's a lot of work to to go into that process and really question. And, working with a motivation which is beyond hope and hopelessness. On the one hand, God, this is so much work, it's constantly changing. I have to, take a lot of information in order to respond to what's needed. And at the same time, having a lot of spaciousness about it. So bringing interest to the situation, but at the same time having spaciousness about it and a lot of compassion, really. Trying to do what we can in this process, to work with solidarity for others, and at the same time, with the difficulties of our own experience of being in this groundless process, where, in historic terms, we're never gonna arrive. But what we can learn is to, let go more and more of that which is in the way of being in the moment, free from all of those fears and desires, which we are imbibing, through our conditioning. So the struggle is endless, but we can choose, to create conditions for compassion while working towards liberation, our own liberation. And it's not going to be like a liberation in historical terms, but it's an individual liberation by letting go of all grasping and clinging to how it should be. But that doesn't mean, that we don't care. And to be in that kind of very delicate balance, between letting go, but at the same time doing what we can. The world cannot be fixed, but still, as long as we are around, we try with all of our might to fix it, knowing that it can't be fixed. So like in the messiness, of the path and in the messiness of our relationships to others, to work with that heart, which is open and at the same time interested. And, welcoming others and helping to create conditions, which work for all of us as good as we can. And for that, we really need to be grounded in what's going on. And not, it's not about not having confusion in the mind, but it's about knowing when confusion has arisen. And then not acting from the confusion, but being with it and seeing, as long as it's present, and then it settles again. So it's not about forcing the mind to be in any particular way, but it's much more about knowing what has arisen. And for that, we need to be grounded. And today I brought a poem by Rainer Maria Rilke. He is an Austrian poet. And you might have heard that poem before, In English, it's called gravity's law. So let's just, settle into meditation now for a good 30 minutes. And starting with becoming aware of the body sitting and the weight of the body. And sensing into the gravity of the planet, which pulls the body and holds the body in place. There wouldn't be the gravity, we would float around like on the moon or somewhere. So that, that the pull of gravity shows us very clearly to where we belong and where we come from. Just, taking stock of how you are today, what you're bringing, if there's tiredness or nervousness or any kind of extra luggage, maybe just let it drop down into the soil underneath where you're sitting. At a time in history where more and more people are becoming aware that we are not in control of planet Earth, but we can learn to attune to the Earth and become custodians. That's what we are supposed to be. We are a custodial species who can enhance, the abundance by supporting it in the right way rather than exploiting it. And as we are opening to that new way of looking at ourselves and our lives as part of the Noble Eightfold Path, really. In particular, what's called like right livelihood and right action and mundane right view and intention. I'm going to read this poem by Rainer Maria Rilke, Gravity's Law. How surely gravity's law, strong as an ocean current, takes hold of the smallest thing and pulls it toward the heart of the world. Each thing, each stone, blossom, child, is held in place. Only we, in our arrogance, push out beyond what we each belong to, for some empty freedom. If we surrendered to the earth's intelligence, we could rise up, rooted like trees. Instead, we entangle ourselves in knots of our own making and struggle, lonely and confused. So, like children, we begin again to learn from the things because they are in God's heart. They have never left there. This is what the things can teach us, to fall, patiently to trust our heaviness. Even a bird has to do that before it can fly. So, and I think, the falling in this context is all of the dreams, of emancipating oneself from dependence on anything and going to terraform Mars or whatever, going to live on the moon, all of these ideas, which are so ungrounded and not really having any substance to it. They're just mind games. Because of the messiness of embodiment. All of the 100,000 things which are happening every day. And, rather than thinking those 100,000 things are in the way of practicing, we can also say this is the practice. These 100,000 things that are the practice. And, remembering that liberation unfolds in the ways we choose to engage in this struggle. This is where the liberation lies, and where the liberation is trained. Not by not having to struggle so we can practice for liberation. This is the misunderstanding. It is the struggle which is the path. And at this point in history, there's an intensification, make itself felt. I think we all feel it, And that's how it is. There's these ups and downs. There's times of relative peacefulness, and then there's times of, great storm and struggle. And we are in such a struggle time now. And it's also part of the practice. And it's not kind of preventing us from practicing, which we might sometimes, think. And then we can know that as well. There's nothing wrong about thinking whatever we want, but to be conscious of it. That makes the difference. That's the refuge, refuge in Buddha, in knowingness, in awakening. And as, the more we are really able to be conscious of what's happening in our minds and in our bodies, the more spaciousness is going to be there, and the more ease in the midst of the struggle becomes available. Because the spaciousness is that which allows for more ease. The tighter we are, the more painful and agitated we become. and wanting to keep things at bay, not wanting to feel, not wanting to engage. And then, our lives become so disconnected from what really matters, making us very weak. Not being able to relate, needing to have things always our way. So simply starting by being willing to be with that, not exactly knowing what to do about it, being okay with that and allowing it. With the intention, to learn from experience, with the support of the Buddha's teaching, which is so pragmatic. And we can always adjust to this gravitational embrace of the earth. It's like something which is always available. And sensing our weight on the cushion on the chair. And breathing up the stillness and the vastness of the earth. As an intelligent being, we can receive instructions from, not by, thinking or by words, but by becoming conscious of that depth of aliveness. We are part of, through the simple fact, that we have emerged out of earth. And we are kept alive by her through eating, drinking, and breathing every day. We never cut the umbilical cord towards earth. But we have lost that conscious recognition because we have lost, all of the ceremonies, all of the practices which our indigenous forebears also had, in the distant past. And we can remember those if we choose to. And that's like a quite dynamic process, which has its own dynamic. And it always starts, with an intention, with a clear intention, that with a wish to remember. For the benefit of our own path and the path of others, human or more than human. We are all together in this. And it's not just all about us. It's like, the ending of what I call the ending of human supremacy. This, very simplistic assumption, which, comes from a very immature self-understanding, like a toddler or something, who wants to control everything. But it's not like that. Tuning to this aliveness, which we can sense inside of our own bodies, the energy in the body, or the energy body. And so with every breath, we are breathing in that aliveness. Then it permeates, the whole body, to the tips of the fingers and the tips of the toes. And if we are sensitive enough, we can really sense that the shift, with the in-breath and the out-breath, not just the expansion and contraction of the rib cage, but also throughout the whole body. The body, which is an organ of listening and an organ of connecting. It's like an antenna or like a receptor for what the biosphere wants to communicate as an evolutionary process, which is going on since almost 5 billion years. And now, coming to we are inside of like a bottleneck, because this one species, the human species, has gotten out of touch and has these very powerful technologies, which are very destructive. They need to be adjusted as, part of the Noble Eightfold Path, as non-harming, because it's no longer sustainable. It needs to be integrated in our cultural narrative. And needs to be talked about. It needs to be taught, by all wisdom traditions. Yeah, as terms of our responsibility for our future generations to be able to be here. And it's not about guilt or shame or anything, but just allowing it to sink in and be with the confusion it might bring up. Because we always think we need to do something. Need to do something immediately. But first we need to listen. Otherwise, what we are doing is just like the same old, same old. First, we need to adjust and attune, and then the doing is going to be a natural response, coming from a responsibility, not just reactivity, just in order to do something to feel better for a minute. That is not it. But the willingness, to go through this transformation. And the confusion, it brings up, which needs to be digested and allowed. A lot of kindness, for oneself and for others, the compassion, the solidarity. And the wisdom and groundlessness of our lives. The groundless ground. And then, using the Buddha's instructions as a way to relate to the groundless ground. I'm just going to read the poem one more time. Gravity's Law by Rainer Maria Rilke. How surely gravity's law, strong as an ocean current, takes hold of the smallest thing and pulls it toward the heart of the world. Each thing, each stone, blossom, child is held in place. Only we in our arrogance push out beyond what we each belong to for some empty freedom. If we surrendered to earth intelligence, we could rise up rooted like trees. Instead, we entangle ourselves in knots of our own making and struggle, lonely and confused. So, like children, we begin again to learn from the things because they are in God's heart. They never left there. This is what the things can teach us: to fall patiently, to trust our heaviness. Even a bird has to do that before it can fly. This understanding, to really stand under. I have, Ajahn Sumedho, my teacher in the UK, he was always speaking about the first noble truth. There's dukkha. It's all about to understand it by really standing under it, which means to go really close to it and feel it, what that means. Not just like, half-heartedly kind of, yeah, but not really being there, not really being available. Because that is how the transformation happens. If dukkha is experienced with awareness, because it is part of life. this instability, this groundlessness is, on the one hand, it's painful and scary. On the other hand, it makes growth possible. It's both. At the same time, it's pushing us, towards growing. And we can allow that process by developing the courage to open to it. Or we can just, frit our time away by trying to get away from it and controlling things. And it's never gonna be successful for longer than a few moments. So the depth of the openness to the struggle is the precondition for wisdom and compassion to be cultivated, or groundlessness and solidarity. The more we have that capacity to allow and be available, have the spaciousness inside of our own being. That, makes possible to be really close to the way things are without shutting down and going into some kind of distraction. And then this is how this, responsibility is cultivated, the capacity to respond. Because there's this openness to allow something much bigger than ourselves, to speak through us, or make itself known, through us. It's not a personal reaction, but it's becoming a expression of the earth herself, what's needed right now. And letting go of this constant move forward into the future as quick as possible and not knowing where we are going. It needs to stop. It's dangerous to continue. So coming back to the pull of gravity, which shows us, where the world lies. It's here, exactly where we are. So today I forgot to bring a bell. So slowly, we're coming to the end of this part of the session, and then we have another 15 minutes, for anyone who would like to share with us